Thought I woke up at 4:30 in the morning to a sound that didn't and oppose. T belong in the quiet woods of the Ozarks. It wasn't an oppose. T the usual whine through the pines, or the local owls calling out to one another. No, it was a heavy, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated right through the floorboards of my bedroom. A sound I knew all too well from my years in construction. The low, hungry idle of a large diesel engine. I remember throwing back the quilt and stepping onto the hardwood. The air was chill, but my skin felt hot, and when I pulled back the heavy curtains, my breath just hitched in my throat because there, illuminated by the floodlights of a massive excavator, was my life in oppose. As work being torn open, a deep, jagged scar of red Missouri clay was being ripped out of the earth right where my gravel driveway used to meet the main road. And standing there in the middle of it all, looking like she just stepped out of a high-end catalog despite the mud, was Diana Thorne, the president of the Clearwater Creek Estates HOA, and she was an oppose. T just watching, she was smiling. You see, I never asked to be part of an HOA. I've lived on these 20 acres since my father passed back in the late 90s, and for most of that time, my only neighbors were the deer and the occasional stray hound. But then the developers moved in, they bought up the old Miller farm next door, and started dropping these $1 million cookie-cutter glass boxes everywhere. And before I knew it, my little sanctuary was being surrounded by people who thought a blade of grass over 3 inches was a personal insult to their property value. Diana Thorne was the ringleader, a woman who treated the neighborhood bylaws like they were handed down on stone tablets. And for 3 years, she'd been trying to annex my property, sending me these polite, then not so polite letters about how my old barn was an eyesore and my gravel road didn't oppose. T fit the aesthetic vision of the community, but what they didn't oppose. T realized what Diana and her board of directors completely failed to grasp was that I wasn't oppose. T some stubborn old man who didn't oppose. T know how the world worked. I was a man who understood technology just as well as I understood the land, and every single inch of my property, from the rusted weather vane on the barn to the bird feeders along the creek, was wired with high-definition thermal imaging cameras that they never even saw. As I stood there on my porch that morning, watching that 7-foot-deep trench widen until it completely cut me off from the rest of the world, I felt this strange, cold calm wash over me. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know someone has just made a mistake they can't fix, because while Diana was standing there, gesturing at the bulldozer like she was some grand architect of progress, my server in the basement was recording every single second of the conversation she was having with the operator. I walked down the steps, my old golden retriever, Barnaby, sticking close to my leg and letting out a low, vibrating growl that mirrored the machine's, and I walked right up to the edge of that fresh canyon, looking across at Diana, who had the audacity to wave a laminated piece of paper at me like it was a victory flag. Morning, Elias. She shouted over the roar of the engine, her voice dripping with that fake, saccharine kindness that makes your skin crawl. Just making some necessary infrastructure adjustment for the new drainage system. I'm sure you understand that the community's safety comes first, even if it's a bit of an inconvenience for you today. I didn't oppose. T shout back. I just looked at the trench, a moat, really, that was already filling with groundwater, effectively trapping my truck and my tractor on the island of my own home, and I realized that this wasn't oppose. T about drainage at all. This was a siege. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to realize that I couldn't oppose. To even leave for groceries or a doctor in oppose. Appointment without their permission, and they figured I'd eventually break and sign over the deed just to have a road again. That looks like a lot of work for a Tuesday, Diana. I called out, keeping my voice steady, almost conversational, while my mind was already cataloging the violations. Did the county surveyor actually sign off on this? Or is this another one of your oppos? Neighborhood initiatives in oppos that skips over the fine print? Her smile didn't oppose to even flicker. She just tapped her clipboard and told me that everything was perfectly authorized by the board's emergency powers. And then she had the nerve to tell me I should stay inside because, heavy equipment can be so unpredictable. I went back inside, made myself a pot of black coffee, and sat down in front of my monitors, watching the live feeds from 6 different angles. And it was like watching a movie of my own destruction. I saw them move the excavator toward the back of my property near the old well house, a place where the property lines were a bit blurry, but the history was an oppos. That well had been dug by my grandfather in 1945, and it was the heartbeat of this land. On the screen, I saw a younger guy, a laborer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, pointing at a stone marker, my official property boundary, and saying something to the foreman, a guy named Rick who I knew was Diana's cousin, and Rick just laughed. He literally kicked the stone marker over into the mud and told the kid to keep digging because, end quote, the boss says the line is wherever the shovel is, end quote. That was the moment I knew this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated criminal effort to devalue my land and force me out. But what Diana didn't in Oppos, Tino, and what I was watching with a grim sort of satisfaction, was that the younger kid was looking around nervously, and eventually he pulled out his own phone and started taking pictures of the very thing Rick told him to ignore. By noon, the end quote, drainage project, end quote, had turned into a full-blown fortification. They had parked a massive dump truck sideways across the only narrow bridge that led to the county road, and they'd started unloading piles of jagged limestone into the trench, making it impossible for me to even think about filling it back in myself. I was officially a prisoner on 20 acres of Missouri dirt. I watched Diana walk up to my well house on the thermal feed. She was looking around to make sure I was in Oppos, watching from the windows. And then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached in her bag, pulled out a small canister, and poured something into the intake vent of the pump housing. She wasn't in Oppos. Just trapping me. She was trying to poison my life, to make the house uninhabitable so the county would condemn it. I felt that old, familiar weight in my chest, the one my father told me about, the feeling that the law is a slow-moving beast, but a man's honor has to be fast. So I reached into the gun safe and pulled out the old Remington. I didn't in Oppos. Load it with the intention of using it, but I knew that in this part of the country, a man carrying a shotgun on his own porch sent a message that a lawyer's letter never could. I stepped back out into the humid afternoon air, the shotgun resting in the crook of my arm, and the moment the foreman saw me, he shut the engine off. The silence that followed was deafening. It was that heavy electric silence you get right before a tornado hits. And I walked right to the edge of the red clay moat and just stood there, looking at them. Diana came scurrying over, her face finally losing that mask of civility. She was red-faced and shrieking about, end quote, menacing behavior, end quote, and how she was calling the sheriff. And I just smiled at her, a real, genuine smile that seemed to confuse her more than the gun ever could. End quote. Go ahead and call him Diana, end quote. I said, my voice carrying over the property like a bell, end quote. In fact, tell him to bring the canine unit and the environmental inspector because I've got some high-definition footage of you pouring something into my well that's going to make for a very interesting night in the county jail, end quote. The look on her face, it's something I'll carry to my grave. It was this slow-motion realization that she wasn't in Oppos. The one in control. She'd assumed I was a relic of the past, a man who didn't end Oppos. Understand the power of a digital trail, and as she started stammering about, end quote, maintenance, end quote, and, end quote, legitimate chemicals, end quote, the younger laborer, the kid who'd been taking pictures, stepped forward and held up his phone. End quote. I'm not going to jail for you, Diana, end quote, he said, his voice shaking but clear, end quote. I recorded the whole thing, and I've already sent the files to my brother. He's a deputy over in Stone County, end quote. The house of cards didn't end Oppos. Just fall. It imploded. The foreman hopped into his truck and sped off, nearly hitting Diana's SUV in the process. And suddenly, the end quote, powerful, end quote, HOA president was standing alone in the mud, surrounded by a trench she'd dug herself, metaphorically and literally. When the sheriff finally arrived, he didn't end Oppos to even look at me or my shotgun. He went straight to the well house with the lab kit, and as they led Diana thorn away in handcuffs, her expensive heels sinking into the very dirt she'd tried to steal, she looked back at me and hissed that she'd sue me for everything I had, that the HOA would, end quote, crush, end quote, me in court. But here's the thing about, end quote, crushing, end quote, someone. It's hard to do when your entire board is being investigated for racketeering, embezzlement, and environmental crimes, It turns out Diana had been using HOA funds to pay her cousins construction company for years. And my property was meant to be the crown jewel in a secret deal with a luxury resort developer that none of the other residents even knew about. The county came out and filled the trench 3 days later, and they did it on the HOA's dime. And now, when I sit on my porch with Barnaby, looking out at the spot where that scar used to be, the neighborhood is a lot quieter, the glass boxes are still there, but the Clearwater Creek Estates sign at the entrance has been taken down, and the new board, the ones who actually live there in Don and Appos, just want to control everything. They leave me alone. They realize that I'm not just a neighbor. I'm the guy who's always watching, and I've got the receipts to prove it. But it makes me wonder, because I see these stories all over the country, people losing their homes to these private little governments that think they're above the law, and I have to ask myself, did I really win, or did I just postpone the inevitable? Because for every Diana Thorne who gets caught, there are 10 more who are smarter, 10 more who know how to hide the trench until it's too late to climb out. And it makes you think, is any piece of land ever truly yours? Or are we all just one emergency board meeting away from being outsiders on our own dirt? I'd love to hear what you all think about that, because honestly, I'm still not sure if I should be proud of what I did, or if I should be looking for a place even further out into the woods where the only association I have to worry about is the one between me and the sky.